My name is Michael Pratt.
And I'm Michelle Pratt.
And we have 5 children and moved to Ukraine in 1995. Initially, we came just to help however we could. I remember when we first went in December of 1994 to see how things looked. We've never been to Ukraine, never been to Europe. The first night that we arrived, we were both so overwhelmed and so shocked by what we saw. We sat on the edge of our friend's couch that night and both cried. We thought...
And said, no way.
We said no way. Ukraine was something like a third world country at the time. And I think one of the biggest things that impacted us both was walking into church on Sunday morning. There was snow on the ground outside. It was right around freezing. It was an old Soviet movie theater. We walked in and light bulbs were scarce in those days, so the light was very dim. There was no heat in any of the public buildings. It was colder inside the theater than it was outside the theater. And yet there were probably 50, 75 people there. All of us in our coats, hats on, and people were singing. You could see your breath. And coming from where we came, from in America, I thought, no, if we miss this, we're going to miss a life-changing opportunity.
I said, I don't want to leave.
Yeah. So
we fell in love with the people.
Yeah, it was the people. The supermarkets they had were very small, and you would have one row of nothing but peas, and that may be all they had.
There was.
Yeah, all there was. Everything else you had to buy on the street. There was a street market. Our favorite meat market was a farmer who would butcher a cow or a pig in the morning. He would quarter it all out, section it out, drive it into the street where everybody lined up. There was a big stump, probably 3 feet across, huge old tree. He would just throw these sections of meat onto the stump and take his broad axe and just chop off big pieces.
And then you cook it to death.
There was little, if anything, left under the Soviet system. When that all collapsed, Ukraine suddenly found themselves completely on their own. And they didn't have the experience, certainly in a world economy, to know how to efficiently provide the products that may have come from other parts of the former Soviet Union. Everything that they had depended upon for governance and education and healthcare and the job was gone. And so a lot of people were in shock. What do we do now? How do we establish, how do we live? Desperate times call for desperate measures, and unfortunately some of those desperate measures were not always legal for people, but people were hungry and
struggling to survive.
Yeah, struggling to survive. So now factories and businesses had to scramble to provide the variety of products necessary for basically a fledgling nation to emerge and grow.
I think the young people recognized, here's a chance for a different and a better life. And so
little by little we began to see democratic ideals and norms began to flow into and creep into Ukraine.
It's very European now.
Yeah, very European. It's a market economy, imports, exports. Ukraine has done very well to engage the world in trade and business and education. After 2 revolutions in Ukraine, was 2008 and 2009, and then 2014. Ukraine was on a very focused and intentional westward trajectory as a nation in every way. They don't express any desire. They don't reminisce for the old days. No, everyone really, really wants to go forward and embrace the West and become a Western European nation.
There is a bit of a difference from the eastern part of the country to the western part of the country. The eastern part of the country is more traditionally more Russian in culture, more Russian in language. The western part of the country, more Ukrainian in culture and language. But if the invasion has done one thing, it has solidified Ukrainian identity as one nation with Ukrainian language and Ukrainian people and Ukrainian ideals.
Yeah. And Ukraine historically has always had a strong national identity. And there's a lot of religious diversity. Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Greek Catholic, Protestant denominations, the Baptists, the Pentecostals, many different churches. After 2014, every year in December to January, February time, Russia would send an army or part of their army to our eastern border, usually around the Donbass area, which is Lugansk and Donetsk and Kharkiv. And so we became accustomed to that, always aware. But in November of 2021, we saw the beginnings of another growing army on our eastern border. The war in the east at that time it's been a frozen war. Armies still shooting at each other, but no appreciable exchange of territory. In December, we began to see the kinds of military units and supplies arriving on the Russian border with Ukraine that indicated an invasion. By January, it was pretty obvious that they were thinking invasion, and we began to prepare. People said, we really didn't think it would happen. We hoped it wouldn't happen. And yet, at the same time, there was this realization that this is probably going to happen. So it was a really difficult time. The initial invasion did reveal that our army was poorly equipped at the time to respond to the numbers and the military equipment and hardware and provisions that Russia had. It was a terrifying time.
I got up that morning and I was the first one up, and I got on my news chats on my app and started to see what was going on. And Mike got up about an hour later and I said, we're at war. And shortly after that, the air raid sirens started, and we started scrambling to try to figure out what we were going to do as a family. And we determined that Nicole, our daughter, and her family needed to leave because they had these little kids, and determined that since we didn't know what that would look like, it made sense for me to leave too. And
my phone rang probably about 7 a.m. A friend of ours he and his family live in Kharkiv, an hour from the Russian border. He called and he was shaken up. He was very, very terrified. They had fled from Kharkiv under fire in the area that they were driving through and needed a place to go. And he called and he said, Mike, can you help us? Can you give us a place? And I said, absolutely, get here. At the same time, Michelle was packing, and that morning we put Michelle's bag in the car and left to take her to Nicole's house. It took us about an hour and a half. Normally 20 minutes. The roads were already packed with cars of people fleeing.
Trying to buy gasoline.
It was a sobering moment because none of us knew what would happen. We said goodbye, not knowing what the future might hold for. I was confident that they were going to safety. We had no idea in Lviv what would happen.
At this point, we've been married 40 years, so that's really hard to leave your other half, in a place where you don't know what's going to happen. Yeah, it was devastating. We sat at the border for about 21 hours. Obviously, the men couldn't leave the country, and we sat during those 21 hours at the border watching those goodbyes, and the husbands walking their wives and their children to the border for them to cross, and them having to turn around and go back, and it just broke our hearts. They went not having any idea where they would end up or how they would be taken care of.
And the men were returning home. They weren't soldiers, but they knew that they needed to go and serve, and they had no idea what that would look like, where they would go, how that would happen, training. They just knew I need to go back.
But at least I can say for Poland, because that's where we went, they have just gone over the top to do everything for these refugees. They had a place to live, they were fed, healthcare, laundry, everything was provided for them. But what we provided was just a place for them to talk. Initially, we just said, we're going to come 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and we just want to be here to talk, share your stories, let us listen. Our daughter ended up contacting some other organizations and put together a trauma care kind of program that we started going through with them then. But initially it was just, let's talk. And we tried to encourage them not to go into a lot of details because some of their stories would bring things back up in other people. That was there if they needed to, but we tried to do that more one-on-one because some of the women were quite traumatized, and some of them did share stories of leaving from the far Kharkiv area close to the Russian border and the things they went through as they escaped. It was traumatic. And
one of the things about Michelle is that all women, but particularly young women, are drawn to her. She has a way with women, particularly on an individual basis, just to really be a mentor.
Those women, they want to be home. They want to be with their husbands. They want to be with their dads. They want their kids to be with their dads. And so, depending upon what part of the country they're going back to, some have returned already It's been a challenge. I've done a lot of reading through the Psalms, a lot of, especially echoing David's words, how long, Lord, how long? I know we're on the side of the righteous in this, and it's hard. It's hard to sit back and watch all that they're suffering and understand. And I know we're not always going to understand. So I go back to something I heard in a teaching years ago that said, when you can't see his hand, you have to trust his heart. And so that's kind of my prayer. Okay, Lord, I don't see your hand. I don't see it. I do. I've seen things in ways he's worked that it could have been worse, things he's intervened when, there are those things. But when you look at the devastation and the loss, it's really hard, especially when you've been there as long as we've been there, actually longer than most of the people in our church. They're young. And so we remember what it looked like in 1994 when we arrived. And they weren't even alive yet. And so we've watched them struggle to become what they've become, and now watch it be taken away from them. It's really hard.
Yeah.
And so, there's that part that says, okay, Lord, I'm just going to have to trust your heart because I do not see your hand in this. I don't understand.
The question that people ask, age-old question was, in situations like that is, why does God allow it? And I really wrestled with that question myself, and was spending time recently in the Gospel of John. Jesus had been teaching in the Temple Mount and saw the man that they identified him as blind from birth. And his disciples, the culture, the tradition, maybe the theology of the time was, if you're born with something like that, or if something, a disability comes into your life, it's because of your sin, or maybe your parents' sin or something. And so they asked him, who sinned? And Jesus responded, he said, neither one. It was so that the works of God could be made manifest. And when I read that, I realized, that doesn't answer a theological question, but it answers a practical question, which is, where are you, God? He's in me. He's in us. God is in all of us. And our response, instead of asking why, is to ask, okay, what do I do now? The city of Lviv itself was prepared with the old former Soviet bomb shelters, but they hadn't been used and were been sitting locked and closed for years and years. Our church, we rent about a 3,000 square foot office space. It's a sub-basement of an office complex, an IT complex. We had already begun as a church to prepare that space for refugees. When the invasion began on February 24th, I started calling people, the leaders in our church, and said, let's meet at the church for what we needed to do. Somebody find mattresses, somebody find the resource for kitchen supplies, for food, we installed a shower, a washing machine, an additional water heater. We bought 24 beds, 24 mattresses. We didn't have the funds for an actual bed frame. The linens and towels and people just began to arrive. Eventually we had up to 50 volunteers, rotating around the clock. As people arrive, we want them to immediately feel welcome, loved, and safe. We had food available for them as soon as they walked in the door. And so we wanted to immediately ease that burden of the horror of what they left behind, and to know that this is a place you can be for, a couple of days. We encouraged people to stay for 2 days as we helped them process. We had psychologists, we had a doctor, we had a chaplain that was there, just to help give people some order to their life, a level of confidence and security. In our city in Lviv, our mayor just has done a fantastic job. He responded immediately to the needs, all the needs, including the refugees, but the needs of the residents of Lviv. That people had what we need to respond and to be safe. And it's the same on the national level. Our President Zelensky, has just done a phenomenal job. He's a wonderful leader that has led Ukraine from day one up until today, taking care of us. I
think whether you're in Ukraine or out of Ukraine, the longer this goes on, the harder it is. We're all tired for different reasons. Those of us who have spent a lot of time away, I have lived out of my suitcase for almost a year now. And the people that are there are tired of the constant interruptions, with the air raids and now the electricity issues. And, you can't complete anything on any kind of a routine because you don't have electricity and you don't have heat. And so, I would say the longer it goes, the more tired and worn out people are, physically and emotionally, but no less determined.
No less determined.
In fact, with every blow, they get more determined. That we will win and we will fight until it's done. It's one of the things we love about Ukrainians is because their background has been one of suffering pretty much their entire history. They've learned how to get by and they've learned how to take care of one another. For us, my daughter and I and her family, when we left, it was so clear because nobody's hoarding, nobody's stocking up. People took what they needed and that was it. No one's doing any of that chaos, and so that's one of the things we love about Ukrainians. They stick together, they work it out. They take care of one another.
When the campaign to deprive and destroy Ukraine of our infrastructure began, the first day they destroyed our power capability. The power came back on within 10 to 12 hours on a limited basis, and now we have had since then rolling blackout. And then there'll be a massive missile attack. And so you know that it's going to destroy the infrastructure again. And what that does to you, the effect on the people is it begins to affect your ability to think clearly, to reason, to make decisions. Your cognitive function is affected very, very deeply, which then begins to affect your decision making. What do I do now? And so in a sense you begin to become paralyzed, but you can't stop, but you feel so ill-equipped and poorly equipped now inside, emotionally and mentally, to be able to work, to be able to respond to things. But rarely does anyone talk about it unless we all sit down, which we do in church. That's what our church services, part of what it looks like now, is we talk about what's going on. And like Michelle has said with the women, we let things out. The campaign to destroy our infrastructure, physically it's working, but it is not destroying the will of the people. It is strengthening
Just the
will of
opposite.
the people. Still American citizens, love our country here, but Ukraine's home.
Especially now that we have a Ukrainian daughter-in-law and a Ukrainian grandson, that's even that sealed the deal if it wasn't already.
That story was amazing. Karina was pregnant with our grandson David, and they wanted to stay through the shelter time and through the rocket attacks. And I thought to myself as I was watching her grow and thought, how is this affecting that child? And we got the call that it was time, baby's coming. And there was an air raid siren. And Karina goes in and gives birth to David, and just a beautiful, beautiful, healthy little boy. But as this little boy grows, he has the most joyful, life-giving countenance about him. Smiling, laughing. He really is a source of light for all of us. The shelter, while we were open, we helped about over 600 people. We served over 5,000 meals. In March, a mother with her two daughters, they were twins, Daria and Lisa, 7 years old, arrived in our shelter. And one of our volunteers had given the girls a teddy bear, each of them a teddy bear, which we did for all the children. And Nastya, our volunteer, said to Daria, to the girls, here, these are for you, you can take them home. And Daria looked at her and said, oh, well, we don't have a home anymore, they bombed it. Nastya, wanting to comfort the girls, said, well, I'm so sorry, but you can take them with you to your new home. And Daria, and this is Ukrainian. This is who Ukrainian people, she's 7 years old. Daria looked at Nastya and said, no, when this is over, we're going to go back home and we're going to rebuild our home. So I heard that story and immediately I said, that's the next step. That's what we have to do. So we began working to establish our nonprofit here in America, New Horizons Ukraine, NHUKR. And we rebuild homes that have been damaged by the war. We work in villages, which are the last places usually to get help. We provide trauma care for people in the village. We completed 10 in our first 6 months.
So it's basically putting a roof and windows back in so that they're dry and warm.
Yeah, and keeping people dry and warm and safe, and giving them hope. These are ancestral homes. It's like my grandfather built this home, and my dad was born here, and my mom, I was born here. And the people in the villages, they don't have a lot of money, and so we rebuild their homes at no cost. We simply want to continue the path of Ukraine's development and growth as a free and democratic country that celebrates freedom and family and opportunity, and want to grow more and more, become a part of the European community. We are a part of the European community. Our website is www.nhukr.org. So you can go to our website, and there we have information about who we are, what we've accomplished, the goals for this year, 2023, and how to be involved.
Help us end the war.
Help us end the war.